Welcome everyone, welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education program, a teacher's training course. Please be seated for those of you who are local here with us. All right, what an exciting day here. I hope everyone's doing well, and I hope everyone's remembering the previous classes that were covered by Chris and William, and of course David as well, as we continue in Chapter 4 of the Respect Unit, the Intermediate Series, Unit 4, Chapter 4 of this intermediate series. And we're talking about here respect and society, because as we've covered in previous classes, and not only in the Respect Unit, but also in the previous 3 units that preceded this, that our society, everything we're learning with character education, keep this in mind. And of course, as teachers, you want to kind of reinforce this concept, this thought in the minds of your student, that everything that they're learning right now is preparing them to interact within society. And this is some of the things we're going to be talking about here this evening, and we've covered in the previous classes and the previous units, in understanding how we are all interdependent. We're interdependent upon one another. We depend upon people making certain doing their jobs, making positive choices, positive decisions, like was covered in the previous classes. When people make immoral choices, and even like the choice to go to war or whatever might take place. Chris mentioned some things about things taking place with the oil and how it can affect everybody else who's dependent on that oil, not just people in that particular country, Saudi Arabia or any of those places, but us here in the United States. The cost of oil goes up per barrel, and what does that do? We see that, we get hit with that at the pump. Well, that's an example of how when we're interdependent upon other people within society. When you think about society, and we talked about there are different societies and different cultures within society, you also have to take the big whole, the global society, where we're all kind of on this planet together. We're all kind of, for the most part, pushing towards the same goal. Now, some countries have different agendas than this country, and like Chris said, some people like to go into different countries and take things because they want them or because it's in their best interest, instead of letting that particular country develop its resource so that it can actually benefit its citizens, the people who are there, giving them jobs and providing an increased gross domestic product and so forth for their country, so that people can improve their quality of living. Well, this is a part of what causes this, when disrespect is practiced within society. Well, it leads to war. It leads to war, and war is the absence of all morality, right? There is no quote unquote just wars, right? There is no quote unquote great wars. We went in there, we fought, we got our enemies, we took them down. We're the winners. There are no winners in war. War is the result of failure on the part of the leaders who engage in these things. And of course, like the previous teacher said, is it their fault that these things take place? In regards to, have they been trained? Have they been taught? Have they been shown the difference between right and wrong? The consequence and the rewards of their actions? Being continuously guided, because character education is not something that you can just sit down once a week and do. Character education is something that, in addition to teaching, you have to practice it. You have to live it. You have to walk it, right? Walk in the ways of morality, walk in the ways of peace and so forth. And as you do so, it becomes your nature. And we're going to talk a little bit about that word nature today as we move forward in these in the lessons. But let's look back here. William covered in the previous classes in regards to the influences, talking about influences and the role of media in society and how it affects people and the decisions that they make and how they choose to respond because of the influences that have been placed in a person's mind. And if you remember what we were covering on page 105, which is where he left off, he was talking about how you know, the influences that come forth from media, you know, and showing that these are things that actually flow into a person's mind. You know, when a person is, I remember, and William mentioned it in the previous class, or maybe the class before, but one of the two classes about being in a trance-like state when the TV is on, and these flickerings of the lights and so forth on the television. You know, the author once said that he was teaching us in a seminar about how to really get our children their minds set, you know, the foundation set in their minds for wanting to read and learn about things that will build their character. Because the common theme in today's society, or the common form of parenting, is just to take a child and plop them right in front of a television, or take a child and hand them a smart device, a media device, a tablet, a telephone, or whatever, you know, so that the parents can do what they need to do and the children won't be in their hair. Well, either way, that child is getting some form of education. So if they're going to be getting some form of education in their formative years and really throughout their lives, you know, the education never stops. At least it does after you die. That is that person receiving education. Then why not take the time to see to it that they're being trained in something that's going to improve their morality, improve their character, improve their quality of living, and in turn it's going to improve the quality of living for everybody else who's affected by the decisions that that child makes when they eventually get old enough to be accountable for their actions. And so he was saying that, you know, you can watch a child and they'll be, you know, as children are, and he was not speaking particularly about like a toddler, but a very young child, an infant, and they could be crying and fussing and kicking and moving all around, and you can turn on a television and you'll watch that child instantly stop, and they'll just be staring at that television. They don't know what's on it. They have no idea if it's beneficial, whether it's cartoons or a home improvement show or a cooking show or a war movie. It doesn't matter. They're entranced by the images that are moving on the screen. It made me think about you know, the very old cartoons that used to come on when people were like in a form of a trance. They had the spiraling, you know, look in their eye because they were kind of in this trance, and somebody can kind of, you know, like get them to come and follow them, and they would kind of just float along and follow them, and they had no idea what they were being led to, or no idea what the influence was that was going into their mind, and they just kind of followed right along. Well, that's what occurs when television is on in front of a young child. They don't realize the negative influences that are being presented before them, like William gave the example of the mother who was kind of frantic about the child who didn't want to do anything. He's punching holes in the walls, and he was, you know, all the time on these video games. Well, when he went there and he went to the place, the child's room, you know, what did he see on the walls? A bunch of posters of Angry Birds, you know, Angry Birds. You know, just the word Angry Birds, and I know that was a pretty popular game for a while. I don't know if it still is or not. You know, what does that put in the child's mind? You know, the child was displaying the influences that were constantly in front of him on his walls, on his mobile device or tablet or whatever. So when something didn't go right, he became an angry bird, right? He became an angry bird, except he couldn't fly away and get out of his situation like he probably would have wanted to, but he didn't care, right? Because his mind was so consumed, he was so entranced with the images that were placed before him. And like William said, you know, the media that was channeling his mind towards things that would cause him to respond with anger instead of finding a peaceful solution. Of course, he wasn't interested in finding a peaceful solution, really probably not interested in much beyond the nose at the end of his face, or the space at the end of his nose. But again, that comes with training. And one day, you know, the young man, he'll wake up and he'll see that there's actually more to life than Angry Birds. You know, people, sometimes it takes them a while to grow up and to realize things about life, the importance. That is, what is important in life. They can hear their parents guiding them and training them and reminding them, and all they hear is like that, like the sound of like the teacher on the old, I think it was like the Charlie Browns. It was wah 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 wah. That's what I guess that's what adults sounded like to young people. You know, it's just wah 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 wah. You know, every time. And I wonder if I sound like that to my children. I don't know. You know, I don't know. But you can see from both perspectives, from a child and from a parent. And as a parent, as a teacher, you know, our desire, our goal is to see our children walk in the right direction, to see them not making the same mistakes and bad choices that we made because of a lack of education. Now, as educators of the Peaceful Solution, we're far more equipped than our parents were when they were raising us to train our children in morality. So if we are in a position of a parent, and that doesn't mean you necessarily have to have a child from your own loins, you know, your own body. Anytime you're around children, you actually take that position of a parent or a teacher. Not that you have to call that child's attention to you, but through your actions, through your words, you're actually teaching them. You are being an influence to that child. And like we said before, whether that child's 5 or whether that child's 50, you know, they become a student of you involuntarily because of your interactions with them. So as teachers, we want to make sure that we're keeping these things on the forefront of our mind, keeping the goal of the Peaceful Solution and understanding our purpose in life, right? You should think about that. In fact, you should not only think about it, but take the time to write it down. You know, take the time to write down what your purpose in life is. And you should have, as we covered, long-term and short-term goals. Because goals, they give you direction. They help you to have a sense of accomplishment in what you're doing and what you're achieving in life. Okay? Remember, having life without goals is like running a race without a finish line. Right? You just don't know when you've accomplished a milestone or so forth. So as teachers, it's a really great practice, you know, to set those reminders before you, even just daily goals. It could be just something as simple as, you know what, I'm going to accomplish these things today. You know, these things are on my list. I'm going to accomplish these things. And then for morality, you know, today I'm going to be more in control of my emotions. I'm not going to allow myself, I'm not going to choose to become angry if someone says something that's offensive, or if I see something that's offensive, or I'm going to choose to be patient in a situation where I would typically become impatient. All right, so it requires a bit of self-examination in these things. And of course, as teachers, we should always be examining ourselves, comparing ourselves to the things we're learning in these books, because that is our benchmark. That's our standard that we go back to. And of course, we exemplify these things in our everyday interactions amongst our peers, students, and even by ourselves. Remember, the true test of self-control is what you do when no one's looking. So it's not like you get home and pull off the mask and now I can just curse everybody out that I see because I'm just totally angry at putting on this fake front all day. No. You know, we live and we breathe positive character. That is, we should live and breathe the Peaceful Solution. So let's go back a little bit here, and just to refresh our memories from the previous class. I know everyone remembers, but it's probably more for me. Look to lesson plan. We're going to go back to lesson plan because we're going to be actually starting here on 106. But let's look back to lesson plan 4, page E, and revisit procedure 8 again. It says, guide class feedback by asking the following questions. How many hours of television do you watch a day? How many hours of television do you watch a week? And then have students read Role of Media in Society, which was done by the previous classes, found on pages 103 through 105 of their handbooks. Tell students that the content of many popular shows is violent and sexually explicit. And you know, William gave the example of the shows that used to come on of what we would call yesteryear, that they actually had morals to the story. There was actually a lesson that was intended to be taught through the show that was coming on. You know, now granted, they didn't have, you know, all the rights and wrongs in place and so forth, but there was more morality presented in television shows, particularly the family viewing things that came on television, 40, 50, 60 years ago, than there is today. The basic television shows that come on today that are suitable for young viewing, PG-13 or whatever the case might be, or even general audience, rated G, it would have been considered like X-rated back in the 50s. Just in the dress and the attire that's presented in these shows, even though they might not be necessarily, engaging in something violent or engaging in something that might be sexually explicit, just the attire as well can place something in the minds of the viewers. That certain things are acceptable, certain things are desirable. And of course, they, as William covered in the previous class, people start to emulate the things that they see. They start to want to practice the things that they see. They might see a particular character on the show who they really hold in high esteem, and there might be the heroine of the show or the smartest person of the show, and whatever particular type of dress or hairstyle or language or so forth that they use, eventually they're going to want to do that because they hold value in the eyes of the viewer. So we have to be mindful of these things because, this is the things that come forth from the media are so subtle. Even for us as adults, they're so subtle. If we're not careful, we could be going down the wrong path very quickly. And this is why education is so important, because education enables us to be able to distinguish between influences that are positive and influences that are negative, because the influences are constant, right? They don't stop. Even when you're sleeping, you might not be thinking about it, but the sounds in your house are a part of the influence of your environment. If something was to change suddenly and there was a sound that you normally didn't hear, or a sound that you all the time heard and now you're not hearing anymore, that might potentially influence your sleep, and you might wake up and go, whoa, what's going on here? Is there a faucet dripping, or someone trying to get in my house? Or is there something going on outside? Those things are influences even still. And even so much so that the things in your environment can actually influence your dreams while you're sleeping. I'm sure we've all had those dreams where we woke up and we thought that someone was blowing a horn at us, on the road, and it turns out that it faded into our alarm clock going off, beep, 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 and we're trying to get out of the road because we're getting ready to get hit by a car that we can't see. So everything, there's so many things that are constantly influencing us. That's why we want to make sure that the things that are in our environment, that is within our control at least, they're that which builds our character. So it says here, stress that many critics have in part blamed television for some of the disrespect displayed in our society. By a show of hands, ask students to indicate if they feel they have been influenced by what they see on television. And you probably get a mixed bag. Like was previously covered. Some students might think, yeah, no, I'm not influenced. I make my own decisions. Nobody, I can watch a television show and it don't affect me one bit, right? And others would be like, oh yeah, I've had that one time. And so you might get a mixed bag, but that's your opportunity to explain how powerful influences are. Have students complete the self-evaluation found on page 106, which we're going to be covering today, of their handbooks, and stress that everyone to some degree is influenced by what is seen on television and the movies. And of course, being this was, written back in the early 2000s, here we are 20-something years later, there's a lot more influential factors or forms of media to connect us to things that can influence us or redirect our pattern of thinking, or change our pattern of thinking, or change what we value, right? Remember what we covered in value, imitate, and practice, in understanding the importance of values and the making of a VIP, and understanding that anything that has the ability to change our values has the ability to change our character, because the values are the things that we deem as important. If a person values, fighting or getting their way, irregardless of the cost or the consequences, right? And if a situation comes up that they don't agree with and they think they're right and the other person's wrong, then they're going to take whatever means necessary in their minds, and that's going to be somewhat determined by how they've been educated, what's in their environment, their influences, their choices, right? And they're going to resolve that situation. And sometimes it might be with fighting. But let's look back to page 105 there before we go to 106 and look at the very bottom there. It says, people can be influenced to imitate the behavior and attitudes they see portrayed on TV, no matter how disrespectful that behavior might be, right? They can be influenced. What, again, it goes back to a part of the strength of that is how a person's been educated to recognize the difference between right and wrong, and of course what they value. You know, if they value or they side with the, they say, I was thinking about, like the examples. Oh, well, here we're going to get ready to cover here, right here, about the great guy and the bad guy, and, the bad guy deserving to be beaten or eliminated. If they value that sentiment or that mindset, then they'll take on that frame of thinking in their everyday life. Well, look over to page 106, because this is the self-evaluation quiz. Now, if you have your own books, of course, as teachers you do, I would take the time to go through this. Now, of course, being in the peaceful solution and learning for as long as we have, our answers might be more persuaded towards the positive side, but, really think about it. Even if there's an inkling of it, be honest in these self-evaluations, because that'll help to identify certain aspects of your character that you really need to work on. I did this and I did this thinking about how I would have responded before I learned about the peaceful solution. And also thinking about it, how I would respond now, just randomly. Anybody can look at a book and go, oh yeah, I'd never do that. I'd never do that. Nope. But be honest with yourself, right? Everybody has those times in their life when the emotions are high, maybe their blood sugar's low, they're hungry, they're hot, they're tired, and somebody, says or does something to them that they could respond impulsively and make a decision that they have to later go back and fix. Well, it's no different with these self-evaluations that we're going to go through here on page 106. There's 7 of them here. It says, take the following self-evaluation to determine how influenced you are by what you see on television. Number 1, I imitate the clothing styles I see on TV, even if they are not appropriate. And of course, we don't have to answer these out loud, but you can just write them in your book. Number 2, and this is something that you would be giving to your students. They should have this in their book, but depending on the class and how it might be set up, you might be, just there for a day or something like that. You would make copies of this self-evaluation test to go with the previous lesson, so you can hand them out and they can go through these and they can keep them. They can keep them themselves so that it's a self-evaluation, so they can see where there's areas in their character that they need to make improvements. Number 2, I practice fight moves that I see on TV. And I think most of us guys, I think we probably all have done that, even going as far as making the noises, and watching Sunday matinee shows, Kung Fu Channel or whatever. I remember doing those things when I was young. I remember watching, what's the Caped Crusader, the guy, Superman, and going through the house like I was flying down the stairs, those were influences when I was younger. Those are the things that I saw. And when I was younger, I didn't really differentiate between positive and negative influences. It was just what I liked. If the bad guy was what I liked, then that's what I wanted to be like. I wanted to have some of his moves, and in a perfect world, I would borrow some of the moves from the bad guys with some of the power from the great guys, and I would combine them, and I would become like a superhero villain, But these are the influences that a lot of the young people have to deal with today, and it's hard for them to, differentiate because they're not being educated to know the difference between right and wrong. So they go with what comes naturally or what they feel is right. Sometimes what they see taking place in their own homes is an influencing factor. All right, and so you have always, sometimes, never, and that precedes every single one of these statements here. Number 3, I memorize famous lines from shows or movies that I watch and repeat them even if they are disrespectful. All right, sometimes, always, sometimes, never. Number 4, I wonder what it would feel like to resolve a problem with physical aggression as is done on television. You know, and I think a lot of us have been in situations as adults where, you know, thoughts have crossed our minds where we, you know, people have a tendency sometimes to really test your resolve to maintain self-control and a positive character, right? And remember, that's what we talked about. Sitting in these classes is one thing. There's not much to contend with when we're sitting in the classes and learning about self-control and learning about respect and acceptance and character and positive and negative choices and influences, impulsive, you know, decisions and well thought out decisions and so forth. It's when we go out into society. It's when we have to interact with people who might be already having a bad day. It's when we have to deal with the person who cuts us off in the middle of the road or flips us, you know, the finger when we're going down the, you know, in the parking lot, and we get their parking spot or something like that that they think is theirs. Even though I've been to, you know, many places, I rarely do see names on parking spots, you know, except for like reserved for the handicapped or mothers or veterans or something like that. Very rarely do I see, you know, Bob or Bill or something like that on the parking spot, but people think it's their parking spot, right, in the free world. And so that is the test of our resolve. Are we going to maintain self-control? Are we going to practice the peaceful solution? Are we going to stop, think, and act responsibly? Or are we going to act impulsively and just deal with the consequences later, right? So number 5 there, it says, I try to get the attention of members of the opposite sex with a line that I heard on TV. Always, sometimes, never. Number 6, I think it is okay if the bad guy gets beat up. You know, and that's sometimes the psychology of these shows, you know. If you've ever looked at a show from a perspective of not looking at it from entertainment, but looking at it from the perspective of seeing what the writers are trying to do, what they're trying to build up in the minds of the viewing audience regarding certain characters. And you can see that they start to build between, you know, scenes and interactions and, you know, how the character acts. They start to build either a love, so to speak, an admiration, or they start to build this hatred, you know, in the mind of the viewer for a particular character. And this is how powerful influences are, because remember, your subconscious mind, it's just watching television. It doesn't see, or a movie or whatever the case might be, it doesn't differentiate between, oh, this is a movie and this is reality. It's just like, okay, yeah, wow, that person did this, they said that. Oh man, I'd be so angry. You know, I'm getting angry right now just thinking about that. And then you'll see yourself or feel yourself starting to build up, you know, a negative emotion because of something you're watching on television, you know, that you also watch probably like 5 or 6 commercials in between, you know. And so it's not real, but the emotions that are built up inside of us watching these things are real. That should tell us right there how powerful influences are, that they create a physiological effect when our minds and our emotions and our bodies just watching something on television. So, you know, the bad guy, you know, gets beat up. Oh, well, you know what? He had it coming. You know, he had it coming one too many times. You know, and you know what's real popular with the shows that are out is the revenge shows, right? Guys, somebody comes and they you know, they kidnap a guy's family, or they murder a guy's family or something. Like there's nothing new. They're not coming up with any new shows. It's the same things that they were coming up with, you know, 20, 30 years ago. But you know, I don't know the names of these things, but the premises are the same. So this guy, you know, he comes out of a coma and he goes and he loads up with, you know, all this armor and so forth and his special fighting skills that he learned at the CIA, and he goes and takes revenge on everybody, right? And that is supposed to be a great quality show, according to Siskel and Ebert, right? That guy really did those guys in for doing that to his family. And at the end, he gets revenge, whether he gets his family back or not. But this is, again, a subtle influence that's placed in the mind of the viewer, especially an uneducated viewer, to think that that's the way to resolve problems. That's how I need to go and deal with somebody who takes advantage of me or someone who's close to me. And lastly, there, number 7, if I could be the hero or heroine of a show that is a female hero, not something you snort, I would choose to fight to resolve a problem. Always, sometimes, and never. So how do you do? This is the question at the bottom. Always and sometimes answers are reason for concern. They show that what you witness on television has influenced you to behave in disrespectful ways. And so just, take the time with your students to, go over those things, ask them if they want to talk about some of the points that were mentioned there and how they responded in some of those things, and even pick their minds to get to see if they would know the proper way to respond, right? How would they change that influence that was placed in front of them? One of the best things would be just completely eliminate it. Don't watch violent or sexually explicit movies or television shows or videos or whatever the case might be. Get rid of those influences because they have absolutely no benefit to the viewer. Zero. They don't do anything to improve your quality of life, your character, your education, to enable you to have more knowledge to be able to accomplish something. So just completely eliminating those things would be the best course of action. And it says here in the box at the very bottom, think about it, any influence that can encourage you to be disrespectful to yourself and others. We can never take ourselves out of the equation, because the things that we do, it kind of has a reciprocal effect on us as well. Whether it's hatred, and Chris mentioned an article about what was it, about grudges or something like that? How it negatively impacts you, how it negatively affects you. I don't remember what the title of it. I was just listening to it a few hours ago before class. Well, Peaceful Solution says the same thing. Holding on to a grudge is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. We do more damage to ourselves than we do to the other person, because we're holding a particular grudge or hatred or whatever because of a conflict that could be resolved if someone humbles themselves and puts into practice the things we're learning in the Peaceful Solution. Of course, they first have to be trained, instead of just wishing someone dies or wishing someone suffers because they did you wrong. So it says here, any influence that can encourage you to be disrespectful to yourself and others is an influence worth eliminating. The Peaceful Solution. All right, that's right. It's worth eliminating. All right, so let's look over to page 107 as we continue in our lesson here today. It says, what occurs to people who disrespect others in society? Now, you might have heard the sayings, for every action, there is a reaction, or for every cause, there is an effect. And I think all of us have heard this, cause and effect, action, reaction, and so forth. For the action of applying heat to a liquid, you have the reaction of a boil. If it's something like, for instance, water will reach its boiling point at a particular temperature, 212 degrees at atmosphere. A little bit higher, it's a little bit lower. So it says here, for every disrespectful act, there is a reaction in the form of either a natural, or a forced consequence. A natural or forced consequence. Well, if we look at our next slide here, because we're going to talk about a little bit, just to refresh our minds on cause and effect. Let's see here. Do I have those out of order? Cause and effect. I think I do. Can you, I might not have saved it. You see the effect of me not saving my slide caused it to be out of order. The cause and effect one. Is that it? Okay. For every action, I apologize for that. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Every human thought, word, and deed is a cause that sets off a wave of energy throughout, says here, the universe, which in turn creates the effect, whether desirable or undesirable. Well, don't even take into consideration the universe, just take into consideration your environment, right? Thoughts lead to feelings, feelings lead to actions, and those actions, as is in this definition here, a wave of energy. You ever walk into a room and you felt, boy, it seems like everybody's like angry in here, or man, this is a very positive environment. That's that energy that comes from every human being. Every human cell actually gives off energy. It gives off frequency, and these things can actually be measured with bioelectric tools, right? Every human being gives off so much electricity. I think we mentioned in the previous class, I read one time that every cell, every atom in the human body generates approximately 0.5, some people say 0.75 watts of electricity, right? Because every cell is kind of like a nuclear power plant, but not one that's going to bring fallout unless you act impulsively. Then there's fallout. You've heard that statement. They had a falling out because someone dropped the bomb with their mouth. They didn't practice self-control. So now there's fallout. Now we got to go back and clean it up. Hopefully it doesn't take 1,000 years, but irregardless, the situation has to be cleaned up. But so if you figure the average human body has approximately, I think the speculation is around 100 to 120 something trillion or 75 trillion cells or atoms in the body, and the amount of energy, let's just say a half a watt by 70 trillion cells, right? That's 35 trillion watts of energy that each human body has the potential of generating, right? That you could power several, who knows, major cities if they found a way to tap into that human energy and get it. But we have a lot of power that comes forth from us, and we don't even realize it. And the majority of that, it's displayed in the things that come out of our mouths. The words that come out of our mouths carry a tremendous amount of power with them, which can build a person up or tear a person down and set them in a course of destruction, of depression, of self-harm, or set them on a course of betterment, improving themselves, seeing how to make society a better place, how to contribute and make life more enjoyable for others. Remember, like the author said, 2 wrongs don't make a right. He heard these things in the face of some hardship or disagreement, and that set his mind at that very young age. That was an influence at that very young age. It laid a foundation as to how he looked at dealing with conflicts. 2 wrongs didn't make a right. So it says here, which in turn creates the effect, whether desirable or undesirable. Then the next definition there says, the law of cause and effect states that every cause has an effect, and every effect becomes the cause of something else. It becomes the cause of something else. Kind of like you see with, I see these things are flipped over. Okay, these are two-sided. Like you see with the example of the ripple effect, right? The one wave causes another wave, it pushes another wave, and it pushes another wave. Or like you see with a simple example of a domino, right? You push one domino, and then it knocks down another, and then another, and another, and then you got all these fancy patterns and everything, and then knocks this down, knocks down, and next thing it turns on the car and it drives away, right? I don't know if you've ever played with dominoes when you were younger, but it would take you, sometimes a long time to set up a nice array of dominoes, and then one of your siblings will come by and just bump something and just totally destroy all the work that you just spent, hours, at least in our child's mind, hours building up. So that's cause and effect there. And then if you look at the next slide under causality, it should be causality. And this is another discipline, so to speak, or another way of describing cause and effect. It says causality, also called causation or cause and effect, is the influence. Notice there, it's an influence, okay? For every action, there's a reaction. Well, that action is an influence that that spurs on a reaction. That cause is an influence that spurs on an effect. So it is an influence by which one event, process, state, or object, which is the cause, contributes to the production of another event, state, process, or object, which is the effect or an effect, where the cause is partly responsible for the effect and the effect is partly dependent on the cause. In other words, without the cause, you would not get that particular effect. Without there being, ice on the road, you would not lose traction and slide on the road, or if the roads were wet, or if the roads had loose gravel, right? So you have to have certain things in place in order for the effect to take place. It's dependent on those things. And it says here, we either receive, in that second paragraph, for every disrespectful act, there is a reaction in the form of either a natural or forced consequence. Well, this word consequence there, for your notes, we have another slide there. Consequence is from the character unit, page 169, and it's actually in the glossary there. It shows consequences is something that logically or naturally follows from an action or condition, right? Something that logically, like it's logical, there's no emotion involved. This is just logically what takes place. This is the next step in events when this thing takes place. It follows from an action or condition. So not necessarily always negative. It could be either negative or positive. Now, in the peaceful solution, we make a distinction just to clarify rewards or consequences. Now, we'll look at the next slide here because we're talking about natural or forced consequences. The definition of the word natural here, it is occurring in conformity with the ordinary course of nature, not marvelous or supernatural. So something that just would naturally occur, right? The spring comes, the weather warms up, you get rains, the grass turns green, the flowers bud up, right? That's natural. Now, something that would be unnatural would be 4 feet of snow, and then you get a big carnation or sunflower popping out of the snow, right? That's not normal, okay? Number 2, based on a sense of what is right and wrong, right? So there's some standard of morality that is there that, of course, person has to know the difference, but there's kind of a set order of things that society should be governed by, what is right and wrong. And number 3, the term used for the result that comes after an act and was also expected to follow it. So, a person, hits their finger with a hammer. Well, naturally, they're going to bust their finger. They're going to create a blood blister. You never get those little blood blisters under your fingernail when you smash your finger in the door or hit it with a hammer or something and it just throbs and hurts. Well, that's the natural response to hitting your finger with a hammer. All right. So it brings about these natural or forced consequences. Now, from the peaceful solution, and think about it, because what we're talking about here is natural or forced consequences that come as a result of behavior, our behavior, right? We're going to kind of break it down a little bit about things that occur just within our environment, but our behavior. If you look at the next slide under self-control unit, page 75, we talk about one of the bullet points here. It says, behave in a peaceful way. Peaceful behavior means not posing any physical threat to anyone. In addition to keeping your hands and feet to yourself, peaceful behavior also includes not throwing, slamming, or kicking objects. Now notice here in the highlighted part, when violent behavior is practiced in front of others, notice what it does. So when this violent behavior is practiced in front of others, so remember we talked about cause and effect. You have a cause and you have an effect, and that effect leads to another cause, which leads to another effect. So you kind of have this cycle of cause and effect. Well, when violent behavior, which is the cause, is practiced in front of others, notice the effect. It causes fear, anxiety, and tension. because of the behavior of a particular individual. This is kind of like a natural consequence that takes place when violent behavior is practiced, because human nature, or the original way of how we are for the most part, is the avoidance of anything that brings destruction to ourselves. The avoidance, we kind of have a natural aversion to harm, right? I tell people I'm allergic to pain, I break out in tears, or running, or whatever the case might be. I don't like pain, right? I learned that when I was very young, and there were consequences for breaking the rules in the home. And I learned at a very young age that I did not like those consequences. So I did everything within my power to avoid getting in trouble, even if that meant just hiding the fact that I did something. But I didn't know back then. I didn't know the difference between right. I did know the difference between right and wrong, but I didn't have a drive for doing what was right outside of just not wanting to get in trouble. And that's not enough to keep somebody. That's not enough for a child or an adult to always make the right decision. Just wanting to avoid the consequence is not enough. No, remember, the goal of the peaceful solution is to change the heart and the minds of those who follow it. So the goal is to get the student to value doing the right thing, accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative, because over time, the fear of the consequence can slowly fade away. Slowly fade away. I've heard people say, if I get caught, if I do this, I'll go do my time. No big deal. I've done it before, right? Like kind of fathers say when somebody's coming by to date their daughter, they kind of put this macho threat on, I better not get any reports of you doing anything inappropriate with my daughter. I don't mind going back to jail, to try to instill some fear in the young man, But that fear of the consequence can go away. It's much stronger to have a strong desire or a love for doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And that holds within a person's mind more than the fear of getting caught. Now, if your behavior causes fear and anxiety in others, the situation can quickly become hostile. Now, if we look at the next slide there, of the self-control unit. This is from self-control unit, page 154. It says both positive and negative actions can affect how society functions. So, a person's actions, like Chris was talking about, it affects how we function as a society. You think about, when the cost of oil went up, there was a lot of things that changed in society that affected how we did business. It affected, in a lot of cases, the bottom lines of businesses. When oil had reached I don't remember what the 128 or 140 or something like that a barrel, and gas prices got to, at least in Texas, they got to over $4 a gallon for gas. I think out in California and some places in California and Canada, I've seen guys saying that they were paying $6 and $7 for a gallon of gas, And I'm thinking, holy smokes, I would have had some nice shoes, walking around or something like that. But people have to function. They have to get to work. They have to live. They can't just drop everything because gas. So they have to eat that cost and take it out of something else. But we saw, shipping fees and gas surcharges and things being added on where we never had to worry about that before. The prices of shipping just kind of went through the roof because, companies can only eat so much before they have to start passing those expenses on to the customer. So have you ever noticed what occurs when a pebble, and it's just talking about the ripple effect here, is dropped into a pool of water? Well, the pebble hitting the water causes a series of circular ripples, each circle larger than the previous one, and this is called the ripple effect. It demonstrates how one person's actions can cause a series of events affecting many others' actions. And like we talked about the cause and effect, it brings about a series of events in those other person's lives that they might make decisions because of this burden that's placed on them. If they're not educated in morality, they might make other decisions that will have a negative effect on other people. People, they start to engage in theft, stealing. They become, when people are oppressed and they can't make their ends, they can't meet their needs and so forth. A lot of times the society becomes very, very hostile. They become very angry. And a lot of times it might be shown in the form of protesting. It might be shown in the form of loitering, looting, not loitering, looting. It might be, they go through the neighborhood and they bust up things and so forth, as a form of protest. But it just negatively ripples out and affects the entire society because of a particular burden that's placed upon them. I want to just take a few examples here and look at some of the differences between natural and force. And we have this example. We're going to look at some examples here in the peaceful solution here. Let's read that first. It says, think of it like this. So we're talking about when disrespectful, for every disrespectful act, there is a reaction in the form of either a natural or a forced consequence. Think of it like this. On most highways, there are speed limits. Although motorists are aware that there are speed limits, some still choose to speed. Now, if a driver loses control of his car and crashes, this becomes a natural consequence of driving too fast. Like I just saw a video that came across the news the other day. It was a 17-year-old. It was the dash cam of a state trooper, and he was engaging in a traffic stop. And some 17-year-old on the other side of the highway in a pretty wide median, he came around the corner really fast, and it was raining outside. It was the interstate, and it was like the car that the officer was dealing with was a magnet. It literally, his car drew all the way from the side of the road through the median and crashed right into the side of the car that was stopped, and the trooper barely got out of the way. Well, that was a natural consequence of that 17-year-old driving a fancy sports car that we're not even going to speculate why and where he got it from, but that was a natural consequence of not driving in a safe way for the weather. Just because the speed limit is 75 miles an hour, for some instance here in Texas, it might be 65 or 70 somewhere else. Anybody who's taken education course in safe driving or to get their license knows that you have to drive what's reasonable for the weather. If it's raining, if it's icy, if it's snowy, 75 doesn't mean I've got to do 75. No, slow it down a little bit, right? Take your foot off the gas, and just get to where you have to get to safely, because it's not worth your life or the life of someone else's. If, on the other hand, so that was an example of a natural consequence. If, on the other hand, the driver is pulled over by the police and issued a speeding ticket, well, this becomes a forced consequence. And there is no, I know my rights, you can't give me this, you can't say my name. My name is patented, or whatever they call it. I don't remember the goofiness they got, but people, they want to fight against the consequence that they caused by breaking the law. When you're going through a city or you're going through a particular state, that state is not, there are governing bodies who govern that state, right? And people say, well, it's my tax dollars, it's my money that's paying for that. Yeah, but the governing body is there, and there are rules in place to keep the citizens or those visitors who are passing through safe. So when a person chooses to break the rules, there's a consequence that goes with it. I know when going through Oklahoma, they have a posted speed limit of 75 miles an hour. And then right under it, it says, no tolerance. No tolerance. No, we won't take your excuse. No, you can't flash us a $20 bill. No, oh, I didn't know. Right? No tolerance. In other words, if you're pulled over, you're more than likely going to get a ticket. Okay? And they're serious about that. I've been through Oklahoma many, many times. Never pulled over for speeding, but they are very serious about their traffic laws there. Let's see how much time we have here. Let's look at the next slide here, because we're going to take a little bit of a comparison between natural natural and forced, because we have the same thing that takes place in our environment here. This is an example of what we see here with natural disasters. A natural disaster might be caused by weather and climate events or by earthquakes, landslides, and other occurrences that originate at the Earth's surface or within the planet itself. And you see in the picture there, some results of earthquake, forest fires or grass fires. At the bottom right, it's droughts. And then you also see flooding that takes place, that occurs. So we have natural disasters. So just as a comparison here between natural consequences, in other words, consequences that come as a result of driving too fast, well, there's things that take place in our environment as well. But as we learned in the self-control unit, a lot of these things, as we look at the example of global warming, they're also the result of the consequences of the activities of man. Let's look over to the next slide there, under forced. The definition of this word forced is obtained or imposed by coercion or physical power, to compel, constrain, or oblige oneself or another to do something, like in the example of the police officer or the state trooper or the sheriff or whoever pulls you over and gives you a ticket, right? They're kind of forcing you to comply with the rules. Well, they're forcing you to comply with the consequence that you brought upon yourself from breaking the rules. Now, you can leave and then keep on speeding down the road. Like I said, the consequence is not great enough to cause a person to make the right choice. It has to be a desire, a value within a person's mind to want to do the right thing. But to compel, constrain, or oblige oneself or another person to do something. So we had natural disasters, and we're looking at man-made disasters. Because I'm bringing this out because it ties into some of the things that we're looking at here in regards to the consequences, not only of what we bring upon ourselves, but like that ripple effect, what we can bring upon other people within society just based on the decisions that we make. And sometimes we can actually force consequences on people by making immoral choices, and people who have nothing to do with our decisions, they suffer the results of it. Well, look at this man-made disasters. Man-made, or I put in parentheses, unnatural disasters. Man-made disasters are events that cause severe loss of life and property and are caused by human intent, negligence, or error. And you can look online and you can find a ton of man-made disasters. One of the big ones that everybody remembers is the Exxon Valdez oil spill, man-made disasters like what was referred or talked about in with 9/11, that was a disaster, and so forth, and many other things. They can be both intentional and unintentional. Like they didn't intend to spill all that oil out of that tanker in Exxon Valdez, but neglect or whatever took place and it created a disaster. They can also be divided into technological disasters such as industrial accidents, like with Chernobyl, and transportation accidents. And social disasters such as warfare and terrorism. They are different from natural disasters, which are caused by natural forces that we have no control over. Man-made disasters are often preventable and result from a failure. Notice here, and I thought this was interesting, it results from a failure of a man-made system. A failure of a man-made system, which means man-made systems, to some degree, to a lot of degrees, are imperfect. And without rules and morals to guide the systems, there are going to be a lot of failures. And one of the biggest failures that we're facing for our last slide there, that ripples outward and can affect everybody else, from the immoral decisions of a lot, as one or two or three or many people who are in positions of power and authority, is nuclear war. And I know that you've heard it many, many times before from many of the teachers. This is something that we're all facing, or on the verge of, because of the decisions of a few. Well, this is what takes place when disrespect is shown or displayed in a society. It can ripple out and affect the entire global society in a way that nobody wants to deal with those consequences. Well, we're going to stop here on page 107, kind of in the middle of the page there. We'll pick up next class, and our next class will be Wednesday, 5/17 at 5:30 Central PM, 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the next class. Have a wonderful evening.